All right, everybody, we are back and we are live. It is Jack Murphy. This is Jack Murphy Live podcast, the live interview version here on YouTube. Will be downloaded to the podcast distribution right after this. You can find me, Jack Murphy, on Twitter at Jack Murphy Live. You can find me here, of course, on YouTube at Jack Murphy Live as well. Hit subscribe. Never miss a video. My book is called Democrat to Deplorable. You can get that on Amazon. Why 9 million Obama voters ditched the Democrats and embraced Donald Trump in 2016. The best book to explain what happened in 2016 and probably what's going on right now in 2020, I would think. And if you're interested in the liminal order, come down and check us out at liminal-order.com. Our 3 core values of masculinity, brotherhood, and sovereignty. If that interests you, come check it out. My guest today is Benjamin Teitelbaum. He is an assistant professor at Colorado University, and he has written a tremendous book called The War for Eternity: Inside Bannon's Far-Right Circle of Global Power Brokers. Benjamin, how are you doing today? Welcome to the show.
It's great to be with you, Jack. I'm doing well.
Fantastic. Great to see you. We've had some good conversations before this leading up, and I know that there's a lot of ground for us to cover. And I want to tease everybody for a little bit of what we're going to get into later on the show. The main ideas here, we're going to talk about this idea of traditionalism, what it means versus modernity. Who believes in traditionalism? Is it growing? What does it mean for us? Who is Steve Bannon? Who is Alexander Dugan? Who is Olavo from Brazil? And their relationship to their respective political leaders in their country. But before we get to that, I want to understand a little bit about you, Ben, and how you came to write this book, because this book reads like, it's first person sort of gonzo journalism and creative nonfiction wrapped into one. A tremendous book. I loved reading it, and it's exciting. It could be a movie, really. The way that you laid it all out. So why don't you just sort of start at the beginning of how you began to research these topics and sort of the evolution from not knowing anything about it to moving into, writing this book and spending years really collecting this information.
So I'm an ethnographer first. That's the way that I do my work, my academic work. And to say that I'm an ethnographer, that means that I like to get to know the people who I'm writing about. And I mean that in the colloquial sense, but of course that's deep. You want to be able to see the world through their eyes. And so I've been doing this for about a decade. I've been interested in ideologies and actors on the far right and the dissident right and the radical right, everything that would be outside of, let's say, the mainstream right. And I knew about some of these ideologies that were really quite marginal within the right. Traditionalism, which I know a lot of your viewers are familiar with probably at this point. And I always associated it with kind of the people who were the least interested in political power and influence. This was like a banner for pulling oneself out of the world of politics and instead turning inward and trying to fight the fight internally in the privacy and in the private domain of one's mind. So I was aware of that and then completely blown away when in 2017 there was a New York Times article that said that Trump's former campaign manager and at that point White House advisor Steve Bannon was at least familiar with this world of thought, and that just blew me away. And so I wanted to study it, and the way that I study this stuff is that you need to meet people face to face. You don't rely on secondhand accounts. You do not want the processed bird's eye view. I want the chaos of the upfront close and personal world of another person's life and the way that they see the world. So it took a year of writing to Steve Bannon's people, trying to follow up on leads, and then when he gave me the slightest hint of receptiveness, you do what you do. You show up on their doorstep and make yourself a problem. And as time as time went on, as conversations went on, he opened up more and more. And
where was the first time you met him?
First time I met him was at his place in Manhattan. He has an exceptionally posh, I suppose you would call it a penthouse. It's in a hotel that overlooks Central Park, and he has handlers going down and working the lobby all the time, and so that's where I showed up, and then eventually just started getting text messages back and said, "Hey, I'm here. What are you gonna?" Yeah, that was the first time.
But where was it that you first encountered these ideas? I feel like I remember reading in the book and talking to you earlier that it kind of started in a weird place, right? Like weren't sure that where the road was going to lead, right? I mean, it was like a music scene.
Oh, sure, yeah. So when I first encountered traditionalism, so the ideas that we're talking about, that was at a time, it was in Sweden. I was doing my dissertation research. I was eventually going to write a book on this, and I did write a book on that. And my research then was about how music was transforming nationalism in Scandinavia and in Sweden in particular. And part of the story in that case was that different music styles, of course, like the far right scene in Scandinavia used to be really focused on skinhead music. And that was fractured and differentiated. There were people, there were neo-Nazis, and then there were people who were not neo-Nazis but still participated in the subculture. But when you hit 2010 in Scandinavia, that first decade of the 21st century, they all started splintering, and you saw an effort to get rid of and distance themselves from that past, but also to revamp and understand who they wanted to be in the future. And so hip hop was being made, reggae, believe it or not, anti-immigrant reggae in Sweden is being produced, a lot of folk music. And all of these different genres were corresponding to different ideological persuasions. So I was really interested in mapping that ideological, cultural, social world, and traditionalism, as I say, these were like the weirdos. These are the people I would love to bring them up to, my journalist or academic friends who considered the right to just be something predictable and kind of crude and blunt. And I'd say, yeah, I'm studying the radical right. That's, that's terrible, man. And I'd say, yeah. By the way, have you ever encountered the Muslims? And they'd be like, what, the Muslims? I'm like, yeah, the converts to Islam. It's just, or what about the Hindus, the Hare Krishnas and the far right? And that's what it was. It was the most eccentric, the strangest people who you didn't quite know how they ended up in this world of politics. And they weren't influential. There were not many of them by any means. I mean, they're few in number, and they're at the margins, but they were just kind of peculiar. That's what they were to me, essentially. A curiosity. Yeah.
So sort of the weirdest of the weird, and this interest, you just sort of pulled on this thread, and it led you all the way through to this conversation, actually, and the book and everything in between, which I can totally relate to. I'm here in this position because I started pulling on a thread 10 years ago. I had no idea I was going to get here. I started learning about male-female dynamics and dating markets and stuff when I got divorced, and that leads you down a whole path when you start seeing how everything is connected. So I can totally relate to just following your curiosity. And in fact, it's kind of fun following your curiosity as your sort of North Star, because then you don't actually have to be terribly an expert in too much. You just have to be an expert in being curious. And that's a power in and of itself.
That's I hate to sound cliche and say music to my ears, but that attitude that you're expressing right now, Jack, is one that means more to me than just about anything. I study politics. We're always used to mobilizing in politics. People who will pay tribute to their own curiosity and treat it with integrity, that means everything. That means everything. And when people, the flip side of that, if someone pushes back, and I become very resentful if someone tries to deny me or someone else their curiosity. It's a fundamental human integrity.
Yeah, and not only that, it's like even if you're opposed to an idea, it's worth exploring so you understand what you're talking about, right? And what you're up against.
Absolutely. For or against is a really simplified, dull way of looking at the world. It doesn't. You don't get anywhere by just taking stand after stand after stand and distancing and embracing.
You mean the world isn't binary?
Imagine
shades of gray, an infinite number of shades of gray here. In this case, I just did Tim Pool's show last night, and the night before he had on a guy who calls himself an anti-fascist. And Tim got a bunch of grief for it from his own fans, from other people, saying that he was platforming a anti-fascist Antifa guy, and that made him bad. But Tim has intellectual curiosity. He
Yeah.
likes to debate people. It's the same thing. I had Alexander Dugan on this show maybe about a month ago, and by no means do I support everything or even half or even a majority of the things that Alexander Dugin was talking about, because he is so influential in the world. And it's really fascinating from just a non-judgmental perspective. It's really worth digging into, which you really did in this book as well. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's about, so often I read a book about Steve Bannon, who's a very polarizing character, and a big question for a lot of reviewers, for example, was, is this a pro-Bannon or an anti-Bannon book? And I never want to respond. I think the answer is fairly clear, but I never want to respond, just because if you just let that question guide everything, you don't get anywhere.
No.
It's stultifying. It's stultifying, and there's a whole world of ideas and things to do with your life that are just closed off if you think in those terms.
Yeah, and I think some of the best art in the world leaves the interpretation and judgment up to the observer, and it's sort of a level of respect that you pay your audience. It's like, you guys are smart enough to make your own decisions. Let's just lay everything out on the table. You don't need me to tell you what to think. Let's just explore the ideas. And so, we have a can you say we have a kindred spirit? I don't know. We have that vibe, that mood in common, Ben. So I think that's one of the reasons why we've related here.
Well, and I wonder, Jack, I mean, you've spent a lot of time in the classroom, right? I mean, you've worked in schools a lot, and you probably know as well as I do. I think about this when I'm writing. If you speak to write for people like they can make their own decisions, and if you pay them the very basic compliment of taking responsibility for their own interpretations, not only do they like it, right, but yet it empowers them, if that word isn't too worn out at this point. It empowers them, but they will learn more.
Yeah.
They will learn so much more if you don't just sugarcoat everything. If there's not moral curation dripping on every word that you
Right,
put out
exactly.
in the world.
Which is like the opposite of how I wrote my papers in college, dripping with all the moral curation that I thought the professor wanted to hear. Yeah, so that's
I would not have given it a good grade, I can tell you.
Yeah, that's another conversation for another day. So, guys, go back and check out the Alexander Dugan interview that I did here, as well as the one I did with Michael Millerman a while back, that lays out sort of who Dugan is and what he's thinking about, because we're going to talk about Dugan quite a bit in this episode. But let's start from the beginning here. Like, what is traditionalism? And if it's useful to compare it to modernity or define modernity, however you think, but let's set the stage so that when we're talking about these traditionalists and their influence on global politics, on the elections, on American nationalism and relationships between superpowers, like, let's give it some context here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the way to get into that, let's start way at the beginning.
Yeah.
So
Is there a beginning?
There kind of is. Traditionalists believe that ages and ages ago, in a time immemorial, that there was a true, authentic religion. And in some cases, they refer to that as the tradition, capital T. And they think that as time goes on, that tradition, that true religion, was essentially broken to pieces and fragmented and spread in all these different ways. And all that you can really find of it today is trace amounts in certain religions. And it's typically the esoteric or mystical brands of those religions. So we're talking about Sufism within Islam, for example. Mystical brands of Christianity, primarily Catholicism and East Orthodox Christianity. In some cases, Kabbalah within Judaism. But first and foremost, the religion that they think tended to preserve the most of this old truth is Hinduism. And so that's their history. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I was you answered the question right then. I was going to ask: is this one true religion? Is it monotheistic? Is it pagan? Is it, Judeo-Christian? What is the sort of defining characteristics?
So it's defining characteristics. One of them, right off the bat, is plurality. Essentially, it's one thing about Hinduism that has made it attractive, especially to the traditionalists who got interested in politics. A lot of what I'm saying is really geared toward Julius Evolas, a figure we can talk about later, to his
Mm-hmm.
interest in traditionalism. But it was the fact that in Hinduism you have this spread of deities, and you have lots of gods, right? And different people will have a different track and a different deity that they worship, and that opposition to complete unification, to the monotheistic universalism, let's say, of Christianity is one piece that they say is part of this earlier way of thinking. Another piece of it is that, and this will the logic will you'll start to see this logic playing into what I've already said, is that they do not believe in notions of earthly progress, typically. Another way to put that is to say that they don't believe in linear time. They do not believe that the past is irrevocably the past and something that would never reappear or reoccur. And they don't think that human existence, virtues, and righteousness is going to be something that you are going to create in the future by virtue of your industry and hard work. Instead, they see time as moving cyclically, that we are constantly in a process of decline, destruction, and rebirth, and that as time moves forward, for all practical purposes, you're going to see the opposite of progress taking place. You're going to see increased degradation, increased vice. And this, of course, plays into the idea of there having been once in the past a true religion that was great, and as time has gone on, we've seen it degrade. And also, for example, their preference for Catholicism and East Orthodox Christianity over, say, Protestantism or something newer relates to the fact that they are seen as more antiquated, which is good. Antiquated is a good thing in this case. And Catholicism's claim to righteousness in this worldview is principally that it preserved pre-Christian ideas. The paganism of Catholicism is what makes it valid for some traditionalists.
The paganism of Catholicism. I wanted to ask you a question first, but then you just said that, and I'm like, wait, what? We'll come back to that. But when you say time is not linear, my first thought is True Detective and Rust Cole sitting there at the interrogation table, clipping up his beer cans, kicking back and saying, time is a flat circle. I mean, to me, he was implying there that maybe it's all simultaneous, or is it, when you say it's not linear, but yet there is definitely a motion in time. Yeah.
Of course. And of course, our bodies, we grow old and die, right? We can see a linearity at some element. But the intervention of the traditionalist would be to say that what matters about time, and especially on a societal level, is going to be constantly in this process of decline, destruction, and rebirth.
Decline, destruction, rebirth. This is a very key concept that we should probably hammer home here. Decline, destruction, and rebirth. Decline, destruction, and rebirth. And where I know that, is it Satri Devi? Savitri Devi wrote a lot about this issue, right, and like who people are relative to these periods. So let's talk about that. The decline, destruction, and rebirth. Are they like equal thirds? Is one like the long thing, and then one is a moment, and then it begin? Explain this to me, and then I want to talk about man in, above, and against time as well.
Excellent. Yeah, we almost have to talk about politics, how this any of this could relate to politics before we get there. So
we promise it all relates to politics. Donald Trump, Putin, Bolsonaro, everybody. So let's go.
Exactly. So in the most kind of generic introductory way of thinking about these time cycles, you would think of it as a cycle through 4 ages or through 4 eras. At the beginning of the cycle, you have a golden age that moves to a silver age, that moves to a bronze age, to a dark age, after which there is a quick split, a cataclysmic event that restarts the cycle in gold. And the exact length of all those all of those eras that varies. I mean, Hinduism has more set notions of it, but if you talk to people who follow this and are inspired by it today, like Steve Bannon, the exact durations aren't that important. What is important is that progression, gold, silver, bronze, dark, lets you know again that time is equal to decline. That every moment that passes by, except for one anomaly at the very end of the cycle, every moment that passes by, things are going to get worse. The other flip side of this, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, is that an optimistic or a pessimistic outlook?
Well, in the short term, it's pessimistic, right?
Yeah.
The thing is, and where things get tricky here, and our minds can get knotted up, is that the way to have a rebirth into something better is to go through something that's bad, and thus the pessimism decline is your gateway to virtue and rebirth. So, which is also what I was going to say, that when you start thinking in these terms, you notice that past, present, and future are all kind of washed out, right? And thinking about the past as being something that's irrevocably past to you, or thinking about the future as being something that's genuinely and meaningfully new, you have to disregard all that. This cyclical nature of things encourages you to see a flattening of all of that linear way of thinking that we're so accustomed to.
What is immediately striking to me is the parallel here between this golden, silver, bronze, dark cycle of decline and rebirth. Reminds me of the hero's journey. And the hero's journey, is for a person who's at their best or in a good spot. They have a crisis. They go through the wilderness. They're lost, and then they're found again. And that's happened to me personally. I'm living the hero's dream right this second. And one of the reasons why the hero's journey resonates so deeply with all of us, I mean, it's in virtually every story that you read, is because it's common. It's built into us. We empathize with it on a deep level. And I'm struck here by the similarities in this concept too, not just on it's personal. Hero's journey is personal, same decline, rebirth. But then here we are sort of on the grandest macro scale of all of humanity, the same sort of cycle and rebirth. Do you see any links there? Or am I just pulling that out of my butt?
Absolutely not. I'd say both the treachery and the perhaps what inspires people with traditionalism is the broad applicability of these ideas. The fact that they are general. If we wanted to be a bit more cynical, we'd say vague. But the fact that they're so heuristically open to us means that we can see so many different aspects of our lives either playing out or not playing out, again, for better and for worse.
Heuristically open. That's a tremendous concept. That is Make America Great Again. That is the MAGA slogan.
Well, and this is something that Steve Bannon and I talked a lot about. So much of the politics that ends up being derived from traditionalism, you could see it playing in other ways, or you could take traditionalism to give you a sort of esoteric interpretation of it. And he saw the MAGA slogan, Make America Great Again, as affirming this traditionalist worldview, that you see cyclicality, and that greatness, that what could be wonderful about someone, some community, some society, some nation would be in its past, but we don't have to think about it as being in its past necessarily, because the past is something that can and will be reanimated again. So,
not all that's past is bad. Not all that's future is good, is one of the main themes that I took away from that, from your book, and from talking to Dugan. And, it appeals to the conservative side of me. And it makes perfect sense. It appeals to the Straussian that's being, pounded into my head from talking to all these Claremont guys all the time, and talking to Michael Millerman, who's a fantastic thinker and a wonderful guy. You guys should check out our podcast with him, and also check out Michael Millerman on Twitter. we're stuck in this phase of life where everybody thinks that tomorrow is going to be better than yesterday, and not in a hopeful way, in the sense of like I'm going to do good in my life, but just like progress is necessarily by definition a good at all times. So
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's interesting. There's a wonderful historian, Christopher Latch, who criticized that way of thinking. He called it essentially the inverse of nostalgia. That if nostalgia is a kind of useless way of dealing with history, and passive, just sitting and ruminating on how great things used to be, progress, and that faith in progress is really just a mirror image of that.
right.
Just leaning back and trusting that every moment that goes by, things are actually getting better.
Yeah. I'm
It's
I'm
it's
jumping
yeah.
ahead just a minute here, thinking about Man Against Time. Make America Great Again. If you are a traditionalist like Bannon, and you believe that we go gold, silver, bronze, dark period, cataclysmic event back to golden. If you believe that we're in like a silver or bronze age, then if your goal is to get us to a golden age, then you need someone or something to take us on the path towards this cataclysmic event so that we can reset. So now I'm thinking about Make America Great Again. Is there an implied next step that's not elucidated in that slogan from Bannon's perspective, in that in order to go from bronze to golden, we have to go dark first? So Make America Great Again in this cycle of thinking necessarily, to me, seems to imply striving towards a cataclysmic event to create a reset. Is that accurate?
Yes, yes. Although there's even more to it, because we could dwell for a moment. We haven't talked that much about like what makes the golden era golden and what makes the dark era dark.
I did say I was jumping ahead.
Okay, can I pull back then?
Yeah, do it, man. Do it.
So, um, one thing again, when we were talking about Hinduism, you asked me what the defining features of that true religion were, and I mentioned that it was segmented, and there was an opposition, a preference for a world where different people had different destinies and different deities and different spiritual practices, opposite what eventually becomes monotheism and universal monotheism, where you have Christianity, and the notion is that God's salvation is available to, equally valid for all of humanity, and this is the evangelistic impulse, of course, in embryonic form there, that it is the responsibility of the Christian to bring that news of salvation to everybody, because it is equally available to everybody. It's universal. A hallmark of the golden age, according to these thinkers, is that it is an age of differentiation and separation. The hallmark of the dark age, one of them is not just the loss of the spiritual, not just a loss of religion and spirituality, and this is why that true religion was lost in this account, because as time went on, we moved further and further away from religion. But it's not just that; it's also mass homogenization. Some of the earlier traditionalists really believed in the caste hierarchy that most people are going to be familiar with, in terms of Hinduism, and think that the Dark Age is the disintegration of the caste, the loss of boundaries, and in its place a mass, homogenized, materialistic, anti-spiritual society. And thus, the transition from dark to golden, it not only involves a revitalization of spirituality, and it also involves the shattering of the mass homogenous collectivity, and mass homogenizing entities more generally. So maybe your listeners probably know where we're going with all of this. The move from bronze into dark and into golden, it involves going to a place of mass homogenization and shattering it into smaller pieces again. Then you find yourself at the golden age. And the question is, therefore, who does this? How does it happen? And is it all just fate? Does the political operative who follows traditionalism, are they just a fatalist who leans back and say, you know what, the time cycle is going to work itself out. I just need to make sure that I ride the wave, ride the Kali Yuga, as some of them do say. But there is a brand of thinkers who actually see a place for agency and for individuals to play an outsized role in that, and who believe that the transitions between ages need to be advanced by actors in initiative, and that's where we find ourselves with this.
I don't think that that's too crazy of an idea. The idea that men and actions create history. I mean, there was a moment at which, when you say it, as was just said, that there is agency in bringing about the destruction, basically, of the world and resetting it to a golden age, that sounds kind of nuts, right? But actually, we're all just human beings, and history is made by human beings. And I've experienced this myself, the sense of like, oh, this is actually how history happens, right? You do something, you express your agency, you do something courageous or bold or evil or good or something.
Yes.
But like this collective collection of actions by individuals is what history is. So this idea that there's agents of change isn't so nuts, but maybe that there's an agent of change that just shatters the world and resets humanity. That might be a little.
Well, I mean, again, it's like what you're talking about the personal biography and the time cycle. It really all depends on the details, right? And what we've talked about is a very open model and frame, and it's the content of it that matters. When we talk about mass homogeneity, for Bannon, he's talking about globalism, of course, and he's talking about those political states. This is where this comes into geopolitics, is that he looks at those political states that are secular or secularizing, and that serve to erase boundaries in all ways that we would conceptualize that. And he takes
that's an important point right there.
Yeah.
Let's hammer down on that.
Sure.
Erase boundaries. Okay. So secular is one thing, and we can definitely point to secularization here in the United States. That's obvious, plain as day. But the dissolution of boundaries, right? So I've had James Lindsay on the show, and we talked about this concept of queering. And when I was a kid, queer was a slur and a noun, and now it is a positive verb, which means to blur boundaries. And the way that I first discovered this was through, like I said, maybe that was before, I can't remember, pulling on the same string of relationships and relationship dynamics. That's where I first discovered this idea of queering and blurring of boundaries when it relates to gender, right? And so we see the blurring of boundaries in gender. We see blurring of boundaries of nation states. We see the blurring of boundaries geographically. We're all long-range connections. We're all lumped together. Blurring of boundaries between maybe good and evil, all kinds of things. So this notion of blurring of boundaries, we see it everywhere in our culture and everywhere right now. So I think this fits in, sort of with the narrative. Yeah.
This is how it's important to point out that boundaries and borders, just like you were saying, in this worldview, they are understood holistically. And it's also a feature, especially of traditionalists working in the right, to think of boundaries and borders as being one collective network. In my book, I suggest a metaphor of thinking of as one coiling neon light that is either off or on, and it includes nation states, it includes gender, it includes everything that anything that the theorist in question wants to put into that mix. And yeah, I mean, to jump in with my own voice, I mean, we do see a world of borderlessness. And we can debate whether that's good or bad, but this is an age. There's always been a lot of movement. There's always been globalization in various ways, but this is an age of hyper connectivity, especially leading up to the coronavirus.
Yeah,
that's certainly what we see.
Hyper homogenization as well. Yeah, and who's the chief exporter of homogeneity? The United States of America, no question about that.
Bannon, now Bannon thinks it's China. We could get to that.
Yeah, all right.
Later, he thinks it's kind of our financial class, but in partnership, and that the actual engine is China. But
in a dance with our financial class for sure.
Yes,
We're
yes.
cultural exporters. We advance the WTO. We build highways and develop transcontinental airliners. We build satellites in space. We have people that want to have open borders. Like we are definitely blurring boundaries. And in talking to Joe Norman a few episodes ago about complexity science and biology and even programming and systems analysis, he was very clear to me that he made very clear that boundaries are really important. And they're really important, as we saw right now with Corona. And what is social distancing? What is cutting off flights from China? Those are just boundaries. We're like establishing barriers, and they're not solid, opaque walls that nothing can come through. They are barriers that we can choose what comes through, and we can elect what comes through, and we can keep things out that we want to keep out. And so we found ourselves in March experiencing what happens when there is a total blurring of boundaries and long range connections. We're all one global village, and like boom, somebody in China gets sick, and all of a sudden my kids can't go to school anymore. And I think that this is all so on theme with a lot of the things that I've been talking about this last season on the podcast here, is that we for decades now have been pushing what I call indiscriminate expansion and indiscriminate connectivity. And we're now seeing the downsides of that. And we're now the trend, I believe, the smart money is on strategic disconnection and the reestablishment of boundaries. And so I can see the very clear connection between an American nationalism and gender roles and not getting Wuhan virus and protecting yourself on social media, etc. I see these trends moving in that direction. How does that fit in this whole discussion?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I interviewed, after the book was published, I interviewed Bannon and Dugan about the COVID outbreak. I wrote an article, actually in The Nation, of all places, and they saw the outbreak. Of course, they didn't. Of course, they're not celebrating the mass death and sickness around the world. But they saw it. Dugan, in his memorable prose, said he saw it as a divine reprimand for globalization and for cosmopolitanism, not for homosexuality, not what we're used to kind of hearing follow the phrase divine reprimand in those of us from the States, but this is, he saw it as a sort of prophesized sacred pushback against the decadence of chaotic movement. And Bannon also said, he didn't put it quite in those terms, but he said that one good thing that might come out of this outbreak is a sort of new localism, and a new unity at a local level. I'm not sure that's happened, but you can see how the thought process works here. That this is, we're starting to push that borderlessness too far, and when something like the virus comes along, suddenly, the pushback, suddenly the island states are doing very well. The geographic literal islands in the world are doing well, and the rest of us who are interconnected are really vulnerable. So yeah, it's, and I can also, one thing, Rahim Salan, who's a really excellent writer, used to write for the National Review, a friend of mine, has pointed out a lot that the borderlessness that we see shaping our society in the past century, and certainly before, but it accelerates after World War II. It can be really great for people at the absolute top of society who are wealthy, socially secure. Anyone else, it's very destabilizing and disorienting. And as you talk about a lot, I know in your show, it also can lead to a stripping of sovereignty, because there is no entity between the individual and the amorphous mass government that you have any formal control over that matters in this case. So yes, it's I think people of various political persuasions can see some real dangers with this too.
Yeah, so the United States, and I know Dugan sees the United States American liberalism, at least as of, say, circa 2015, was clearly one of these homogenizing forces. The concept of American liberalism is a universal one in that we in America, the notion is that every single person on the planet deserves, expects, and should have the same rights and roles and opportunities as we do in America. And in doing that, we then see natural logical extension combined with our propensity for manifest destiny to say, okay, everybody else out there is wrong. Basically is the bottom line, and it is incumbent upon us to not only say you're wrong, but then to change your mind and to implement our system and to force it upon you, even if you don't want it, even if it's not going to work, even if it's never going to work there. And perhaps the Iraq War was the epitome, and maybe perhaps even the, what do you call it? It's a peak, but the
Swan
nadir,
song, the
yeah,
nadir,
yeah,
yeah.
the nadir of this concept as we like really tried to put it into practice, and it really totally failed.
Yes.
So when Dugan talks to me at least about American homogenation, you know what I'm saying, and American liberalism and universalism, he made it very clear to say that was leading up to Trump, and we can talk about that sort of turn a little bit later. But I want to flesh out a little bit more here. What happens, gold and silver, bronze. By the way, quick side note, this made me rethink the title of Bronze Age Pervert's book, Bronze Age Mindset. I used to think it was specifically harkening back to the literal Bronze Age, but it may have been an oblique reference to this Bronze Age in the cycle. And I wouldn't be surprised if he was familiar with these concepts at all. So I don't know. Are you familiar with
Interesting. I'm not.
you're not? Okay.
No.
Yeah. So you guys out there, check out Bronze Age Pervert. I did a podcast with him a while back. Very interesting writer. Again, someone else I don't agree with 100%, but worth checking out. We're checking out. So let's talk a little bit more just about the logistics of this like the golden, the silver, the bronze to dark, and the individual agency. What types of agents are there within this environment? Who are the actors? What sort of roles do people assume, and who are those people? What do they do, etc.?
So the theorist associated with the right who started to ascribe roles to actors in this was a very certainly I'm going to just flat out say sinister, even the person, even me who doesn't want to put labels on people. She was self-identified essentially as an esoteric Hitlerist. Look that up at Holmes, kids. Who her name was Savitri Devi. She becomes a Hindu. She converts. She reads Gunal and Neville. I write about this a little bit in the book. She thinks about these time cycles, but she believes that there are three categories of figures who interact with this time cycle in meaningful ways, and that they are men above time, men in time, and men against time. So above, in, and against. And the men who are above time are essentially the monks, the ascetics, those who become awakened to the fact that progress is a lie, that past, present, and history are all folded together in this time cycle. And what they do is they pull themselves up and out of it. They're no longer part of this cycle of decline and rebirth and this endlessness. And being enlightened, they lead a much more placid existence. But they don't do much. They save themselves. They might inspire others. And the metaphor that Devi used for them was that they were like the sun, and that they simply radiated. They didn't necessarily get involved, and their presence wasn't always material to people, but they radiated an existence. And in that sense, they might actually draw others with them, but it was nothing that they tried to do. Opposite that, you have figures who would embrace and enact the modus operandi of the time cycle, which is destruction and violence and decay. And if they did it to such a large extent that they participated in the actual currents of time via their destruction, then they were called men in time. Because remember, time is tantamount to destruction. And in Devi's thinking, time is also tantamount to violence. It's not just destruction of abstract entities like states and publics and societies. It was also destruction of bodies. It was literal violence, and the hallmark of these figures, of these men in time, was that not only that they destroyed on such a large level that it had a sort of eschatological historical significance, their destruction, but also that they did not know about the time cycles. They need not actually be aware of their role in history. There's a hard border between them, let's say, and the men above time, the monks, who understand everything perfectly and pull themselves out of society. These men in time have their nose to the ground. They are acting. They are pure actors. They are not thinkers. In other words, and the metaphor for them was lightning that Devi used. And then the final category are figures who would use destruction, knowing that destruction served this larger purpose. And so they both combined, let's say, the insights of the men above time, the sun, and also the understanding that destruction was essential to time, the men in time, the lightning. And these are the men against time, and their signature is both lightning and sun. And so this is dark stuff. She looked at Hitler, Savitri Devi, as being a potential man in or against time. She thought that he seemed to exhibit both the willingness to destroy and also a sense of purpose. It wasn't selfishness, let's say, that was leading his cause in her mind. She eventually becomes disillusioned with Hitler somewhat, but is also a Hitler worshiper throughout time. So this is not someone that I'm going to exhaust a lot of effort talking about redemption. What is important about this is that her writings gave a sort of theoretical way for traditionalists to understand a role for an activist, broadly conceived. This is not, she wasn't speaking to figures who wanted to just lean back to just the man above time, let's say. Political actors, I hate politics these days, but guess what? We have to go through all of this stuff through liberalism. It's going to break on its own, and I just need to keep myself safe. After the break, I'll go and enjoy my life. No, she said that there's a role for actors, and that gets picked up, and that's where I heard some strange phrases in my conversations with Steve Bannon that pointed me into this direction.
Fascinating. Yeah. Quick. Lightning, I feel associated with Nazis. Is that right? Did she take lightning from the Nazis, or do you think they embraced that notion? She came after him then, right?
I don't. Yeah, I mean, I know, of course, what you're referring to. I actually don't know the genealogy of her metaphors there.
Yeah, so, me neither. Interesting stuff. Stuff. And it does make sense that to categorize people, if you believe in this sort of life cycle, and that there's going to be actors and histories made by individuals, on the margins. That there's going to be people that are in it. There's going to be people that are against it. There's going to be people that are like, hey, watch out, all this is happening.
Mm-hmm.
None of that is too terribly crazy, but it does get a little bit weird when maybe you start actively seeking out people who fill those roles, right? So are we ready to move on to that part of the conversation yet, or should we continue should we flesh out a little bit more about the traditionalism? Because there is something really fascinating about it to me, about a consolidation and an expansion. I'm getting a sense, say time is decline, time is decay. To me, all of a sudden I'm hearing time is entropy. Whoa, entropy is also a universal law in the of thermodynamics, right? Like, so man, is there like a relationship here? Isn't the Big Bang supposed to be a cycle that like happens and starts and happens again? So it's not too out of left field to think in these terms, I don't think.
No, I mean, at least, again, when we view them at a bird's eye view, from a bird's eye view, excuse me.
Yeah.
Then we're looking at very, very open structures that, the basis, what I think is useful to some people with traditionalism, that just puts up a bunch of ideas and groups them together, and it kind of encourages you to see connections between them. See a connection between secularization, let's say, borderlessness, progress. It doesn't always explain the connections between them, but it encourages the person reading them to do so. And And again, I mean, we can say it's crazy or not, but it all depends on what you put into it. We haven't talked about, for example, Julius Evola, this figure who really carries traditionalism to the right. And essentially all the time when I'm talking about traditionalism in this conversation, I'm referring to his brand of it. You know, he was a Mussolini admirer. He thought that Hitler and Mussolini were merely good steps in the right direction. And the way that he's thinking, it has to do with that caste structure in part we were talking about earlier, that orders priests on top of warriors, on top of merchants, on top of slaves, and the opposition there is spirituality versus materialism. Those who look to the sky versus those who can only deal with the ultimate materiality, which is their body. He added to that hierarchy a lot of things. He added men and women, masculinity, femininity. If not men and women, he added the geographical north to the geographical south, past, future, and also Aryan, non-Aryan, or primarily Semitic. So, and that certainly accounts for a lot of his appeal to more reactionary white nationalists, race nationalist groups, starting in the 1980s in Britain primarily, and then moving forward and spreading out outside of Italy, of course. So that's an example of, I mean, you get this structure, and it can mean various different things, but the values that you plug into it, in the literal nature that you add to it or do not add to it, that makes all the difference here, I think.
Yeah, it's very easy to project into whatever structure that you want, and the looser and sort of if they're loose and they appeal to sort of our humanity, we have our own life cycles. We see it around us in nature all the time. So it's, even in my own head right now, I'm like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. It's sort of aligned to the physics of the universe. It's aligned to the hero story, which is in our DNA. It's aligned to a number of things. So in some ways, it's like a radical idea. In some ways, it's totally like maybe the most banal observation that there is.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of this, when you said earlier, Jack, that, some of that resonates with your conservative impulses, this value for history and this skepticism to progress. Yeah. I mean, it's a tricky thing. It's been a very hard thing for me writing this book to separate out, okay, when is traditionalism active? When is it simply a language to mystify what is a slightly more common belief and value?
Yeah. Chunking up is a concept that people use in order to be persuasive. It means like, we're talking about this, we're talking about an apple, and you're asking me what my favorite apple is. And I'm like, well, let's just talk about the trees. Actually, we'll talk about let's talk about the whole agricultural system here. That's really what we're talking about. And when you start chunking things up, simple things, you chunk them up, it's very persuasive. People see you as an authority figure. It's sort of a culty thing to do. It's excellent in writing to do. It's excellent in rhetoric to use it. So in this case, maybe they're taking something very simple, as noticing that as you get old, you fall apart, and that's bad, and then you die, and maybe you get reborn. Taking a concept like that and turning it into some whole huge mystical, framework for the universe that gives them justification for whatever actions they want to take, right?
It can be, yes, and especially if you infuse spirituality and religion in it, then we're dealing with an even heavier hammer.
Hey, and that's why we're talking about it here. Way to go! Yeah. Congratulations, guys. All right. So, do you think we've given like a good enough primer here on traditionalism?
Yeah. I think so.
Yeah. Random question: are you familiar with the concept of axial age?
No.
The axial age. It refers to like the time at which like our major civilizations sort of came into being and then set, basically the framework for where we are today, right? The major civilizations of like China, India, the West, etc. And then there's the pre-axial age, which was before these civilizations emerged, and then now they have, and so we're in that period, and it may be coming to an end or may be continuing on. Just thought I'd throw that out there because it's a concept that I've been toying with or just sort of trying to learn about lately. But
And it also puts us at the edge of a cataclysmic event right now.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay.
Yeah, pretty much. Interesting. All very fascinating, and also interesting to me as I was reading the book, the connection which I hadn't made previously between Hinduism and traditionalism and the West, and how people could find an appeal in Hinduism, even if they weren't born in India or like come from that culture or whatever, and how they're connected, even though, you sort of feel like today that they're very distinct and separate.
Sure. I mean, there are deep roots to that, and some of them again are pretty sinister. But it is true. I mean, there are also some generic and historical connections between Hinduism and the pre-monotheistic mythologies of Europe. There are patterns that I used to teach Old Norse mythology here at CU.
Oh, cool.
In Boulder, and it was something I love to talk about, the way that the Eddas, the historic documents of Old Norse mythology, replicated some of the patterns of Hinduism. The creation of the beginning of the world, a cow appears out of nowhere, and this signals some resonance with what people probably know about Hinduism and the veneration of cattle, but also the ordering of the gods in the Old Norse world that replicates this priest, warrior, merchant hierarchy. And that also parallels the languages. They're Indo-European languages throughout most of Europe, with the exception of Finnish, and some of its related languages, Estonian and Hungarian. All of those belong in the same broad language family as Sanskrit. So yeah, the pathways for lots of people to identify with Hinduism are many, really.
Fast. That was a way better answer than my question. Thank you for that. Do you think that there's a direct connection between the language and the culture being spread and these ideas existing, or are they just so common to human experience that they surfaced in different places and have commonalities just because we're all freaking human?
That's a huge question. I love the question. I cannot answer that, of course. That we do. I mean, we do know there are. I mean, the language tells us that there are actual, cultural connections and historical, anthropological connections between the people involved. But, but the concept of cyclicality, of course, is animated in the turning of the seasons. So that's an example of one way in which we might not be looking for civilizational or personal and societal connections between different societies that might endorse this way of thinking.
Yeah. Fascinating. So much here. This is why we're talking again. Benjamin Teitelbaum, author of War for Eternity, Inside Bannon's Far Right Circle of Global Power Brokers, a title chosen by your publisher. You want to tell us what the other title was?
If you're looking at the book in the UK, it will say The Return of Traditionalism and the Rise of the Populist Right.
There we go. The Return of Traditionalism and the Rise of the Populist Right, which, from my perspective, probably would have been a better subtitle. It certainly lays out the real themes and depth of the book, rather than it seemingly just being like inside baseball on Steve Bannon, which is what the subtitle seems to say here. And also far right. I'm surprised they didn't say cabal.
Yeah, and power broker, and the grammatician in me, it would otherwise, far right should have been after circle.
Circle, exactly, of far right, exactly. Oh, geez,
I would have red penned it had it showed up in a paper.
And I look at the cover too, man. Red, bam. Buy the book, guys. It's a fantastic book. You will learn a lot. I loved it. I've read it twice through. Red Hen, my girlfriend, is reading it currently right now. Fantastic book. Everybody go out and get it. And I'm not just saying that. All right. We have laid out general broad strokes of what traditionalism is. We have laid out this notion of no linear time, but a cycle from a golden age to a silver age to a bronze age to a dark period and a cataclysmic event, which represents the total homogenization of the world, the destruction of the class system, the devaluation of the warrior and the priest, the loss of the spiritual, no spiritual connection, no upward glances to the sky, focus on the ground, materialism. Sounds familiar as to where we are right now in parts of the United States. So that's traditionalism. How does Bannon get involved with this? How does he find this in his life? why does he bring this into politics? Like, let's sort of animate the Bannon character in this story now.
Yeah. So I think you could describe it as being rooted, and this is how he opened up when I asked him to tell me about it. He said that as a youth, as a teenager in Richmond, Virginia, he was raised Catholic, but he didn't think that the Catholic Church had a vibrant spirituality to it. And when he gets to college, as did a lot of people in this age, I mean, we're talking 70s here, a lot of especially young white men got really into Buddhism. Especially a lot of young white Jewish men, as in particular, is the Jew booze is a phenomenon unto itself. But Bannon, he gets into Buddhism. He continues this interest. He continues it more or less in secret as well throughout his years in the Navy, when he really becomes a kind of a hardcore dude, conservative, especially on the outside guy. He's very, very interested in spirituality. One thing that I actually had my research assistants help me with is I talked to him about his years in the Navy when he would travel around to different seaports, and he would just start name dropping in the cities where his destroyer was docked, the names of the local metaphysical New Age bookstores with the incense and the crystals and all that stuff. And he knew the names of all of them. And we went through and we found where they were. We found what they were called. I mean, so anywhere he was going, he had a mental map of how to get to the nearest, place to buy a book and cleanse his chakra and everything. And so he's continuing to do this. And somewhere in that time, he never was able to give me a firm date on it. He encounters the writings of an author named René Gonon, who really is the original traditionalist. Some traditionalists would question that, just because they think traditionalism is true. But the person who really codifies this system, that's René Gonon. It's definitely not political, but very deep, very hard to read, extremely difficult to get through his text. But Bannon is captivated by them. He's also interested, it's not just traditionalism, he's interested in all types of alternative spirituality. So he's reading Madame Blavatsky, who becomes this sort of matriarch for the New Age movement. He becomes very interested in a figure named Gurdjieff, who is more mainstream, but not much. He's read by a lot of like Hollywood executives and producers who want to find themselves. Let's say this is big in the 1980s and 1990s. And it's not just that he's reading these books. Bannon reads a lot. He can really name drop titles and authors like basically no one else I've ever met. But by the time we get to the 1990s, he starts associating with other people, especially who are into Gurdjieff. And he's living in California, and he's flying people to his house. He's rich. He's flying up to San Francisco and spending time with Jacob Needleman. So it's in this period of time where he is consuming this broad field of writing, the alternative spirituality. He remains a Catholic, yes, and he's always been been keen to reassert that to me. But he's doing a lot of things that I think more doctrinaire Catholics would not be too into, and consuming a lot of religious texts, and also opening himself up to the idea that Catholicism is really a pathway to something else, something bigger. And even Christianity might be a pathway to something else and something bigger. And it's important to note, especially for people who, for various reasons, think that Bannon is a pure phony. And there are reasons there. He can be a blowhard and bloviate. His interest in alternative spirituality and eventually traditionalism, it predates so much of everything else that we know him for. So it has been constant, whereas a lot of other aspects of his life could appear dilettantish and capricious. Anyway, so he is reading this, associating with people in the 1990s based on his interest in these thinkers. And when sometime after he becomes interested in politics, then he encounters Julius Evola, who's this figure who brought traditionalism and right-wing politics, anti-liberal politics together. And that was a revolution for him. He said that was what brought that old interest in his burgeoning political interest together. And again, over time, we see that this is not just a book that you read. I read lots of books and different authors. It doesn't necessarily mean anything about my identity or my plans, but he eventually starts to associate with people on the basis of their interest in Julius Evola. So this is not a casual interest.
Fascinating. So he has a lifelong interest in alternative spirituality. He's like a truth seeker, trying to find himself, reading weird books in weird places all around the world, being transported by the Navy all around the world to pick up these crazy books and learn about a whole new way of thinking that he carries with him through his whole life. And what I'm really want us to sort of nail down here is, if Bannon is a traditional, would he say I'm a traditionalist?
With qualification, yes. He would say I'm a traditionalist in this sense. He was always eager to distance himself from Julius Evola's race theories, for example.
Yeah, I can see why. I mean, there's a lot of shady characters in this field here, even though some of it strikes me as actually being pretty reasonable, but some of it strikes me as being pretty out there and probably not so good for everyone. And this is really the crux of the question here is, what does Bannon see as his role in the life cycle? What does Bannon see as Trump's role in the life cycle? If Bannon believes in traditionalism means that there's a homogeneity, I didn't say that right, and a loss of the spiritual and a focus on the materialism, and others, we haven't talked about Dugan just yet, but Dugan points out in particular that American universalism is the mechanism by which a lot of this sort of destruction is happening. How does one hold those views in their head and then become the campaign manager and top advisor to the leader of the free world and the Western world of liberal values and liberal universalism and exporters of cultural homogenization, etc.? How do we square all of that, Ben?
I'm going to take it in reverse order in the way that you laid it out. All right, let's
However
start with
you'd
Trump.
like.
Let's start with Trump, because the question of America is much thornier. So in passing, in one interview, Steve said to me, Donald Trump is a man in time. And he just went on, and I didn't say anything. We were talking about something else. He's extremely hard to interview. He's unbelievably hard to interview. That's true on TV, but when you get into this stuff, it's impossible. And so he says Trump's a man in time. Okay. Does he know that? Is that a common phrase? I'm talking to my friends and family about that. Later on, he says to me, the importance of Donald Trump is that he has the will and the ability to destroy and disassemble and disrupt. And he does not need to understand his role in history. I'm paraphrasing now, but the quote is in the book. But that he said specifically, we were talking about time cycles. Donald Trump does not need to understand time cycles or anything of the nature. To me, that wrapped up the question in some way, whether or not, Bannon never said, I read Savitri Devi. That would be worse than reading Julius Evola. That would be a bigger scandal if anyone is paying attention and is knowledgeable. But he laid everything out for me essentially to say that he sees Trump as playing this role. It's not just in the abstract sense that he wants Trump to be the person who carries society across the 0 point from dark into golden by virtue of disassembly and destruction. But he even used some terminology that illuminates the origin of it, calling him a man in time. So that's what Trump's role is, and it's not that mystified for Bannon. It is the disassembly of the administrative state in the United States. It is the disassembly of this amorphous globalist state that, as he sees it, which America plays a role, even if he doesn't think it's its centerpiece. Trump was doing what Bannon was wanting to do in Europe ahead of that time with the European Union vote and Brexit, to see that mass entity shattered into smaller pieces, where you would see differentiation and borders resurface, where instead society had been working towards erasing them. So that was Trump's role, and the conversation that he and I had then was, okay, so you, Steve Bannon, you are aware of the time cycles. You are enlightened, but you have chosen not to pull yourself out like a man above time. You are not a monk, right? Or an ascetic living in, hidden in the cliffs of the hillside. You are working to bring about this particular change. So what does that make you? And brought up the Debbie's typology, the laid out the existence of a man against time. And when I said that, it was one of few times when he was quiet in our interviews, where he really didn't say much. But of course, someone who's working to disassemble and who sees a historic purpose for it is the lightning and the sun as a man against time. That's where he would fit into this way of thinking. But he didn't say it to me. He was quiet.
I'm going to take a pregnant pause there just for dramatic effect. Fascinating. Do you think your opinion? Do you think Steve Bannon specifically sees himself as the lightning and the sun with a mission?
Yes.
That's heavy, dude.
If you want a straight answer, that doesn't mean, of course, that he fills those categories with the same meaning that Savitri Devi does or Julius Evola does.
True. Very well qualified, Ben. Thank you.
But this is a guy who has an account of history and an analysis of geopolitics that yearns for disassembly of the mass entities, and thinks that doing so also has a role to play in the revitalization of spirituality, in sovereignty, and in returning to an order and a state of affairs that he considers to be more virtuous. But you get there by destruction, by shattering the edifices. That's how I'm thinking, just to let you into my reasoning and why I answer your question in the affirmative.
Yeah, I mean that's why I asked the question, because I had the same feeling and the same notion, and it makes sense, and it maps onto everything we're talking about. It maps on even to his political activities. It maps onto the early advice that Bannon gave Trump in terms of the cabinet and the people that he chose to run the administration and the executive branch and the various department heads. State Department, they came in and started tearing things up. Betsy DeVos is coming in, trying to break up school unions and advocate for school choice. The list goes on, as you elucidate in the book. And interesting side note, and I don't have a strong point on this, but I did talk to Amanda Milius, who was a Trump political appointee at State, and I asked her, did you feel like in the beginning days that they were actually trying to dismantle the State Department? And she didn't really have, and no slight on her, she didn't really have a direct response to that. But I am beginning, I'm trying to ask people that question as we go through this process, just interviewing folks and debriefing, hopefully preparing. And from my perspective, I don't know about yours, hopefully preparing for 4 more years, or an off chance debriefing and post-morteming the last 4 years. This conversation about Trump being man in time, unawareness, of his role in the golden to silver to bronze to the dark in return, that and then Bannon's use of Trump to advance that timeline, that jives with another theory and framework that I've worked with to analyze the Trump phenomenon, in that the people that voted for Donald Trump, myself included, wanted to launch a weapon at the uniparty, the hegemony of the Democratic and GOP establishment, sort of stranglehold on politics and law, along with the corporations and the financial class. Donald Trump to us was seen as a tool, as a weapon launched by an insurgency, a networked insurgency, that emerged out of our, ultra connected social media environments. And we basically, like, have you ever been to a mosh pit and there's like a girl in the mosh pit and she needs to get out, and the crowd just kind of like pushes her up onto the top and then shoves her up onto the stage, and then they can, so that she can get out. That's kind of like what Trump was. I mean, he wanted to run for president, obviously, for many years, but like the network coalesced around him, pushed him up, and just threw him up there as a weapon, as a way to disrupt, right? As a way to disrupt what we see as the collusion between the Dems and the GOP, the corporations, the sellouts of the moneyed interests, the devotion to globalism, neoliberal, neocon, foreign policy, wars, WTO, global trade, the whole thing, this homogeneity, right? This exported American homogeneity. We wanted to destroy all of that by throwing Donald Trump up there. And so I didn't, at least at the time, have a framework of this cycle, this traditionalist cycle. But I do see how like our networks became aligned in that time, because if Bannon's guys and his, far right circle of global power brokers, if they wanted to, sorry dude, if they wanted to use Trump as a weapon to disrupt, and then regular Americans like me and the people that listen to this show wanted to use Trump as a weapon to disrupt, well, then we have the same goal, and that's called a network alignment. And that's why our networks came into a coherence, and that's why we all work together to achieve the same goal, even though we came at it from different perspectives, may have had different priorities, may have different reasons, but we did have a common goal at the time, and it still stands, honestly, to disrupt and dismantle this uniparty that's dominating American politics. So that framework that John Robb has helped me to flesh out. He's been a guest several times on the show. Check out those podcasts. It aligns. It makes sense. It works. I'm matching patterns now and getting a more complete understanding of the Trump phenomenon. I should write another book.
yes, you should, Jay. Your first one was really fascinating to read, by the way.
Oh, thank you very much.
It's the one thing that traditionalism might contribute to this that we might not expect to hear from it. There's a degree of specificity in this is in its notion of cyclic time, that if we are in the dark age, if we're at the precipice of a major event, like a lot of these theories posit, they say one of the hallmarks is the complete saturation of materialization across all aspects of society, culture, and politics. And we're so consumed, especially in the US, and thinking about the differences between Democrats and Republicans. But when viewed through a traditionalist lens, what would come out was their common devotion to materialism and disregard or disinterest in spirituality. How does that manifest in the US and across Western Europe? Well, it is the fact that the definitive question in politics deals with the marginal tax rate and wealth redistribution, right? And the fact that a lot of nation states really are understood in our official political discourse as being nothing but economies that exist, yes, within a geographic framework, kind of, less and less so, but that it's a practical benefit, again, that it lets us see that there is, everyone is kind of materialist. It was one thing I wrote about in the book, that Bannon was really excited by Marianne Williamson, by her candidacy. He even tried to get me. I think he knows that I kind of, even though I'm not left enough for a lot of people in my world, I still lean left. And he wanted me to
get out of here.
I know, I'm not fail the purity test usually, but he wanted me to write about Marianne Williamson because he saw her as representing. Yes, she's interested in reparations and these economic policies, but she was speaking in broader spiritual terms about time currents and the essence of an era in a society and a community. And he saw that as not pushing politics to the left or the right, but pushing them up. Right. And away from materialism and up towards spirituality. So when people talk about the uniparty, you can think about it in various ways: their corruption, the fact that they all socialize with each other, they all live in DC. But there is this fact that, they're all, economics is everything. The cultural issues are generally treated as a distraction or a way to mobilize people so that we can have the economic politics, manifest itself in some way. But everyone, it's all materialism.
Do you think that? Oh, there's Rosie making her appearance. If you can hear my dog barking, oh, the mailman must be here. Wouldn't be a lunchtime podcast without it.
Absolutely.
Do you think that there is a relationship between the founding in America, the distancing of separation of church and state? Is that the fundamental? I'm not saying this is the flaw. Is that could be considered a fundamental flaw when perceived by actors like Dugan and other folks, traditionals, who are chastising America for exporting a non-spiritual, culture? Is that because, and we're going to get to this, America is a highly spiritual culture. And at the time of the revolution, it was a highly spiritual culture. There were people in the countryside who believed that they were founding a new Zion. They were new Israel. They were God's chosen people coming out of the wilderness and into the wilderness to create a new society. And they believed that this was a spiritual journey, and they aligned with the cosmopolitan, thinkers of Adams and Jefferson and such in order to affect the revolution that they wanted, so they could have the freedom to be as spiritual as they wanted. So to say that there's not an American spiritualism is totally false. But in our contract, right, they are separated, and so therefore, are our politicians not almost relegated simply to economics rather than items of spirituality or culture in that regard?
That's the question. Part of the way to respond to this, and this is the key issue for the traditionalists, is where does American essence live? Some people have said, "Oh, Steve Bannon is just a libertarian," and here's the difference. Here's where you see this stuff matter: is that the Constitution and those founding documents, those Enlightenment era secular documents, that for a lot of people on the left and the right are the actual essence of what America is. For a traditionalist advocate of Americanism, they are not. For Bannon, Americanism existed prior to that. And I've heard him say things like that he thinks that the documents were divinely inspired. That's kind of typical conservative-ese in a way. But when I've had the more in-depth conversations with him, no, he said that this has to do with the pilgrims coming over from Europe. That it was an expression of European spiritual yearning that comes to America. And eventually, we have the revolutions and stuff. It might not be as dramatic a break from the traditional conservative, I shouldn't use the word traditional, conservative
right
narrative that we're used to, but even a small deviation, it means a lot here. He does not think that our essence is tied up with democracy, universal human rights, those things that let's say a traditionalist critic of the United States like Dugan, getting back to some of your earlier comments, that he thinks when he's being critical of America, define America. The problem is in where Bannon would be breaking from the other traditionalists is that they tend not to dislike states, and they don't dislike state religions. They like theocracies. In fact, Dugan is very enthusiastic about Iran today because he sees in it the unification of state and spirituality. And the criticism against the United States, of course, is that in throwing off King George, we did away with a political model that placed spirituality at the heart of our politics. And yes, there's this flowering of spiritual and religious life elsewhere, but it's at least a critic might be able to say, well, it's not going to be a unifying spirituality in any degree of specificity. We might all recognize that. And I've heard Europeans say this to me about America, that you have freedom of religion, but so long as you have a religion, the people who opt out are kind of not on the map in the American cultural geography. So that is, that's the critique, that if we had religion in our state more, in our political life, we would have a collective religion that actually unified us in some sense.
I mean, America is certainly built on Christian values. There's no question about that. And it was built largely by Christians, and the Pilgrims is the story that we always hear. And it's just interesting to me to consider the fact that we had religious libertarianism in many ways, where it's like basically go and do whatever you want, and there wasn't a top-down direction. In fact, the whole premise was that for the first time a nation state, I believe the first time, we might have talked about this before, first time a nation state was created, without an intermediary between God and the people, right? So
Mm-hmm.
whether it's the king or the priests, the United States and the people that founded America, they wanted and believed they had a direct connection to God. They didn't have to have the priest tell them what to do, or the king tell them what to do, or the government tell them what to do. And I can see in some ways it's maybe a more pure form of a spirituality. I'm not making any judgments here because I'm not an expert in this field by any means. And to me, that is an exceptionalism that is outside of the resultant American materialism that we see in 2020. And if that idea was embraced in a more widely fashion in the United States, then maybe there would be a different mood, let's say, just a different vibe here.
And when you put it in those terms, Jack, too, it makes us think that it sets the stage for a dynamic where you would have an elite that, by virtue of being elite, are almost by design are not going to be spiritual, and then you would have a people. So this is very much the populist dynamic that Steve Bannon talks about. Then you would have a people that was much more spiritual, and there would be with all of the effects and consequences of that division in tow that we would expect. That's the critique, that there's an elite that is out of touch and is resentful of the backwards religious populations that it governs, that it wants to drag kicking and screaming for their own good into the future.
Right. I have to make a confession. I mean, I was raised Jewish and Catholic. I have a bar mitzvah. I celebrated Christmas, went to mass sometimes, not a lot. But culturally, that's how I was raised. And maybe because I didn't have one all the time or whatever, but I did not take that with me out of my childhood. And my parents, it was cursory. It was performative. It was like, I get a bar mitzvah. It's not like we were saying the Shema and it's
one of my favorite parts of your book when you talk about your bar mitzvah, actually.
Oh, thank you.
The lost tribe of Israel being in Ireland. But,
yeah. Sorry, well, that's what my rabbi said because if you haven't read the book, which you should, Democrats to Deplorable on Amazon.com, get one now. I opened it up by talking about my bar mitzvah and my Jewish and Catholic background, and how at my bar mitzvah there were, by virtue of it being an Irish family versus a Jewish family, there was like 10-1 Irish people in the temple for my bar mitzvah. And the sermon that the rabbi chose was to say that the lost tribe of Israel was actually the Irish folks. And so he brought us all together there that day. And I thought, that really has stuck with me now, almost 30 years later. Holy cow. 30 years later. So I kind of forgot where I was going with this, to be honest, but we were talking about so secularization. So there's the elites, cosmopolitan. I know that word has a lot of connotation to it. I'm using it loosely here. Elites in the cities versus the people in the countryside. And the people in the city, I think, I don't have the statistics here in front of me, but if we were to break it down, my assumption would be that the secularization adoption rates, if we want to talk like tech, is accelerated within the blue cities, and it's less so in the red countryside. And, that's like a subject that, my confession, that's not a subject that we hear about a whole lot. But my confession was that growing up, I had a disdain for religion, I think, as a teen in my early 20s.
Yeah.
And living in the city, going to, Georgetown University, and even though it's a Jesuit, ironically, it's a Jesuit school, but it's totally staffed by and attended by totally secularized globalists, 100%. And just sort of got this sense that if you believed in religion or spirituality like that, you were some sort of rube. You just were hanging on to myths and just weren't an intellectual and just weren't smart and really disdained, looked down upon. And it took me some time to shed that programming. I'm not necessarily religious today, but I am more open to it today than ever before in my life. And for certain, my respect for people who are religious and have faith and belief, it's not just even respect, it's damn near now jealousy. As I watch these people and their lives and their energy and their commitment. And I heard Kanye say the other day, holy cow, it was so powerful on Joe Rogan. He said, I take the fear of God and replace, or I take all of my fears in life and replace it with the fear of God, and in doing so, I fear nothing. Man, that struck me. That was really heavy, and so
Articulate for.
super articulate. The guy's a crazy, wild genius. I strongly recommend listening to that podcast just to observe what was going on in that man's head. But that was such a powerful statement to me that really resonated. And it's odd that my growth in understanding spirituality and religion as a positive thing is contraposed against the decline in religiosity in the United States. And correct me if I'm wrong. We talk about why the people are Democrats, why people are Republicans, why red, why, but it's not particularly emphasized that it could really be a distinction between a spirituality and a lack of spirituality.
No, as in whether you're Democrat or Republican.
Yeah.
And it's, I mean, of course, there's a big part of the Democratic Party that is religious, and you have people on the right. Karl Rove, for example, has been pretty forthright in saying that he doesn't have faith. And yeah, it's where some of this could rest is that the attitude toward progress. If progress is understood to be overcoming our past, and if our past is seen as a history of superstition, of brutalizing superstition that we have clawed our way from just in baby steps toward enlightenment, that telling of history is going to be more at home on the left as it exists today in the United States. No doubt about that.
Yeah. Interesting. It's interesting part of the narrative that I don't hear emphasized too terribly much. All right. We've established traditionalism. We've established Bannon's interest in it. We now understand Bannon's perspective on Trump as a man in time. We understand Bannon's perspective of himself as a man against time, the lightning and the sunshine, the lightning and the sun, and his unspoken but perhaps evident desire to see Trump used as a tool to aid in the destruction and dismantling of all these things that Dugan or Bannon sees as antithetical to the traditionalists. Well, actually, part of the process of destroying these things in traditionalism. So let's bring in the other character now. Let's bring in Alexander Dugan. Regular listeners to the podcast will be familiar with him by now. Michael Millerman and I did a Dugan for Dummies, which was a great introduction to Dugan, Heidegger, and Strauss. I highly recommend that. And then, of course, I had the privilege of interviewing Dugan himself just about a month ago, and that was a fantastic conversation. And also, your book was really helpful to me in preparing for that and preparing for that conversation. So thank you very much there. Yeah. But let's introduce Dugan in this context, his perspective on traditionalism, where and how it works out in geopolitics, and how and why perhaps there is a relationship, as hinted at by the cover of your book, the far right circle of global power brokers. Let's flesh that out now and complete the picture.
Yes. So he encounters Julius Evola, René Guénon, and Gurdjieff, also this spiritualist that Bannon was interested in. Alexander Dugan encounters that in these dissident circles in Moscow. If Dugan's biography is wild, it's really wild, off the wall. But what he did for himself is that he took the opposition of the golden age and the dark age, which for traditionalists is tradition versus modernity, and he read that in geopolitical terms. So he thought to himself that if you looked at the world today, you would actually see a division between the modernist states and the engines of modernism and the traditional states, and those that were leaning towards a much more traditional lifestyle, both with the normal sense of traditionalism that you would understand lowercase t, and the more specific stuff we've been talking about. And he also wanted to bring about a revival of tradition in the world. And for him, that meant supporting Russia against the United States. He thought that Russia, even if only by virtue of its geography, the fact that it is more landbound and thereby less fluid, less less borderless, more static, more in tune with eternal values rather than changing values, in his words. That Russia was preserving that, and that Russia also had the geopolitical might to oppose modernity if it worked well with itself. The United States and the Atlantic powers, they're all these seaside societies. They are going to naturally have a draw toward moving around, cosmopolitanism, globalism, all of those things. And so Dugan not only writes texts, but he also gets involved in politics. I think his undeniable moment of influence is when he writes a book called Foundations of Geopolitics at the end of the 1990s, becomes standard reading for a generation of military leaders in Russia, and lays out a case, lays out a rationale and a reason for Russia to reassert itself after the fall of the Soviet Union, and how also to sow discord in the United States. And that has been his life. He's been in Georgia when Georgia and Russia were having a fight, of course, over Ossetia and Abkhazia. He was very active in Ukraine. Eventually gets himself in some serious trouble and loses his positions back home for taking a side of the Russian separatists. He saw Georgia and Ukraine as marking these key areas of conflict between Russia and the United States, but also between tradition and modernity. And he wanted to make sure that Russia asserted itself and drew a line in the sand. And he also has been involved, as we've learned just through a trickle of insights and disclosures. He was also involved in the conflict in Syria, and was doing his best to make sure that partnerships between Russia and Turkey were strong enough to keep the United States out of that particular conflict in Syria and over Syria's future. So this is a figure who follows everything that we've talked about, wants to see a world of borders, thinks about borders even in more expansive ways than what we've been describing, not just between genders and ethnicities and nations and things like that, but he also wants to see different epistemologies, we would say, different understandings of truth, and to see a flowering of spiritual, academic differences throughout the world. And does not want, and sees the United States as a force that is encroaching upon them and spreading across them. So most of his existence has been, as a political operative, has been about pushing back against the United States and unifying the actors that are anti-American. If they are Mujahideen, if they are China, if it is Russia, if it is South American socialist states, he wants to see them all united against the United States. That's been his drive.
Yeah. So I asked him directly about that. It's crazy thinking about, you just laid it out. He's like, yeah, he wrote the Fourth Political Theory, the required reading for, entire generation of military leaders and probably KGB and Putin and all these guys in Russia, wildly influential. And there I am looking him straight in the eye on my laptop while he's in Moscow and I'm here in DC. And I say to him directly, I was like, so you wrote you wrote that the destruction of America was the primary goal. How am I supposed to feel about that? And his response was that he had changed his mind. He had said that he's like, well, first of all, I wrote that in the 90s, man. He's like, times have changed. The 90s were a long time ago. He even called me dude. Just kidding.
Yeah.
He's like, those are the 90s, dude. And, and he's right. The world was a very different place in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. The prescriptions for the resolution of the Cold War, differ vastly from what would be a rational thing to do in a post-Cold War world. And so, it was maybe even slightly unfair of me to ask him a question about something 30 years ago, but at the same time, it was pretty fundamental to his worldview. So it was important for us to discuss that.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. It was a heck of an interview that you had with him. Certainly hearing you guys talk about spirituality, as you and I have mentioned, I mean, that was certainly enlightening for me to hear his thoughts on that. But when he really laid out that change and made it formal to you, I haven't ever had that particular conversation with me. It did draw my attention to something that he said about Bannon. We talked a lot about how Bannon views Trump in these esoteric terms, but Dugan has an analysis of Bannon in these esoteric terms. When he knew that Bannon read Julius Evelyn, was a traditionalist, he thought of Bannon as being a sort of eschatological sign that things were turning. in world politics. And the fact that the way he put it to me is that in the midnight kingdom, and that's us, that's the United States, sees us as driving modernity at the midnight hour after Obama, after he sees, in his mind, our globalizing, liberalizing potential starting to reach its culminating point. Not Trump, but Bannon shoots up in the air. So this is like a flare at sea if it's a darkest night, and all of a sudden you see a flash of light shoot up in the sky. And that's Bannon. And that he knew that something was going on, and that these deeper truths, that the currents of time were shifting, because a traditionalist was now in the White House and couldn't believe it. The way that he spoke to me, and thinking about how he spoke to you on your show, I have to think that this also plays a role for him. That moment when he first learned about Bannon's traditionalism and interest in Evola in particular.
Yeah, well, man, so many things coming out of that. He told me specifically, said when Trump came, everything changed for him. He maybe became aware, it's probably not the right word, but had a greater appreciation for the power of the countryside of America, a connection of what I was talking about before, of the Revolutionary era sermons that I've been reading, because that's just what I do in my free time. I read sermons from Massachusetts countryside from 1748. I'm not a nerd. I'm not a nerd or anything. Oops, I just pulled my headphones out. This is live, so no problem at all there, guys. But listening to him talk about his change of heart, it was like really fascinating and powerful, because he could see the spiritualism within the United States, the heartland of America. Interestingly, people off the coasts, right, and his theories of land and sea peoples, people that are unmolested by constant change and free to be rooted to the earth and to the soil and to the land and to themselves and to their particular ethnos, I think is the word that Millerman would want me to use right there. And so it showed him that there was a part of America that fit into his positive worldview, rather than, from his perspective, rather than America solely being this force for darkness, bringing on the midnight kingdom. Midnight kingdom. That's a powerful phrase. Holy cow. That is powerful. And so it's really, that felt like a really big moment philosophically, just like to hear him say that as specifically as he did. It shocked me so much. I thought there's a chance that it's like specific misinformation. Like maybe it was just a shot down the pipe to confuse us a little bit, or to make us think he's not, make you think he's a little bit more benign, or at least aligned in some ways with our goals. It was that striking to me. I still haven't decided whether or not that is the case just yet, but it felt authentic. The look on his face felt authentic. Of course, he's probably been trained by the KGB and how to talk and manipulate people. So I'm not gonna put myself out of the realm of not being, maybe a sly talk by a trained professional. But at the same time, it was particularly striking.
That line, the thought process that you were involved in, you were just talking about right now. I mean, that's something that I have to deal with in the book all the time too, because I have, platform. There's no way to sugarcoat that. People who others would rather see disappear into history. And I would take, if you take a look at your interview with Dugan, did he make himself seem completely benign?
No,
I don't think so.
Yeah.
He's came across as being different. I think that is borne out if you look at all of his communications in recent years. That is more in line than not with what he shares in social media, what he's written about, what he's spoken about. But I gotta commend you though, Jack, because if you had been totally obsessed with making sure that he didn't get the better of you and you would be inoculated against any accusation of normalizing or platforming, it would have been a boring interview.
Right.
And we would have come away as stupid as we were before, knowing nothing about the guys. So it's a legitimate concern, but there are very few people who are that skilled and can really just pull the wool over everyone's eyes and confuse us all, and we come away thinking, oh, this is we're going to see Dugan on Sesame Street next week or something like that. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. So just a quick kudos to you on that.
Oh, thank you very much. I put a lot of time preparing for that interview, as I do for all of them. But that one felt there was some real weight to it, and I wanted to make sure I got it right. And I do try to take the same approach with everybody, which is like, let's just have the conversation and leave the judgment up to the viewer.
Yeah.
I do plenty of opining on Twitter and when I'm on other podcasts and stuff too. I don't need to just smack people across the face. It's not conducive to exploration for good things or for bad things. So we've talked about traditionalism. We talked about Dugan. Bannon. We talked about Trump's role, Bannon's perspective of Trump as potentially being someone here to help the dismantling that leads us to a new golden age. We talked about Dugan and his perspective on traditionalism, where it comes from, how he sees it play out for his Russian people, how it works in global politics. One of the things that's coming to mind right now is like, what kind of time scale do you think these folks are working on, in the sense of like, okay, time is not linear and all these ages happen. I mean, do these guys think that like the moment is like coming really soon? Like, right, this is it.
I mean, yes. Although, I mean, I think that the true answer to your question is that they're on whatever time scale is convenient. Especially if they're political, they are political operatives. They want to do things. And for Bannon and for Dugan, I mean, they looked at the world and they saw that, oh my gosh, populism and nationalism, a destruction of the mass society, this pushback against globalism, suddenly has wind in its sails that it hasn't had for a long time, depending on where you think its roots actually lie. And so, yes, the notion was, now is the time to push. There were, going back to traditionalism, there's a brand of thought. We've talked about riding the Kali Yuga. Another way to put that is riding the tiger. That's the phrase that Julius Evola used in the past to say that, you know what, don't fight against modernity and liberalism. If you do that, all you're going to do is sacrifice yourself. You're just going to walk right into the jaws of a monster that can and will devour you. So instead, draw back, fade in, preserve yourself, and wait. And that's not the way that any of these people are thinking right now. So much we know. Whether or not they think that, Trump was it, or Brexit was it, or Bolsonaro or Putin is it. I think that you would get varying answers on that depending on when you ask them, and also on the fortunes of, we'll see what happens next week.
Right.
If Bannon really thought that Trump was it, or if a cynical reading of his biography would suggest that, Trump is a stepping stone for him to something above.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So Dugan sees Bannon as a conscious agent of change, whereas Trump is an unconscious change agent, or at least one with a consciousness directed in a different direction.
Yeah, not to the sky, not to the stars.
Yeah. So if let's put this into some context here. If a Trump presidency is representative of a potential reawakening or a strengthening of an American traditionalism, one that has deep roots, goes all the way back to, you want to talk about the real 1619 project, right? The real 1619 project would be that we came here to be closer to God, right? And like at first, and that would be an interesting, thread to carry through all the way to today. But I'm not an expert on the founding by any means, so if I'm wrong on that, somebody let me know in the comments. And so here we are now. Maybe the visceral reaction to Trump, maybe the total, like, the derangement in people, the complete loss of rationality that we see among some opponents of Trump, the whole systemic reaction against Trump. Is there any chance that like the greater system understands the threat that Trump brings? Trump's not a racist. Trump's not a sexist. I mean, maybe he's an old timey sexist, but he's not like a sexist today. Like, he's none of the things that they accuse him of, but he is potentially this force that could be working towards the end of modernity being here, analogous to Americans, universal liberalism, etc., and the cosmopolitan elites in their secularized world and their materialism and all that. Do you think, your just opinion here, Ben, that their reaction is like, oh fuck, we've been invaded, we're infected, this is a lethal threat, like, and so they just throwing everything at the wall and spazzing out in every way possible because they do feel it as sort of an existential crisis, not only just to this moment, but like maybe to like the whole big thing.
Yeah. I mean, if what we're talking about, to understand what you're asking, Jack, is whether or not the opponents of Trump see him as posing a threat far deeper than just an individual's racism or sexism, for example.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that there is a perception that, it goes by other names. Nobody would say, my mass oppressive globalist plan is now being. But where you would see that conception coming into play would be if people say that, oh, we're surrendering our role in the world, or American leadership is declining. I think a lot of the commentary on China, that especially with the trade wars and the tariffs, fretting about an intercollected, open, free society. Those have been the labels that have let us know what is being described is that globalist world that you're referring to. So yeah, I think there's a ton of consciousness about that. That what is at stake is not a nation, but is a global model of political life and political behavior. No doubt about it. The tricky thing is again for Bannon or for Dugan working against that, is that they don't agree as to where it's coming from. When we start talking about globalism or the globalists or the elites, the virtue and the vice of that perspective is that, where are they? We might be able to know some examples, but where's its center, right? What are its where are its bylaws and its rules? And we don't see that in the book. I chronicle a meeting between Bannon and Dugan. They met one another in Rome in 2008 and had a day long conversation with each other, and tried to persuade each other. It's somewhat noteworthy that both of them at the time, probably in some way, shape, or form, were being patronized or funded by opposing Chinese interests. In Bannon's case, an anti-communist party Chinese expat. In Dugan's case, it seems to be somewhere in the murky worlds of party or governmental leadership in Shanghai in particular. But they were trying to convince the other that it was either the United States that was the core of liberalism, but Bannon was trying to get Dugan to see China and its production market, the fact that so many goods are produced in this secular state that is also, it's not invading other countries, but through economic and infrastructure investments is creating a network of itself that crisscrosses and is opposed to boundaries. That China is what is actually creating this world, and that China is therefore the source of modernity, and if you really wanted to bring back a traditional world and the world of borders, you need to fight not against the United States, you need to fight against China.
I don't necessarily disagree with that notion, but well, first of all, what a fascinating conversation to think that Dugan and Bannon sat down together for a day, all day, with like lunch in the middle and the whole thing. Mm-hmm. And can you imagine guys who think so strategically and with such depth and clarity? Imagine how careful they were in the timing of the things they said and the energy that they put into the conversation and traps and baits and just I just to have been in that room must have been just incredible. And if I remember, didn't one or both of them deny that meeting ever happened? Or
well, Dugan denied it to me, although he had mentioned it to a very, very small newspaper a couple months earlier. And now, after the fact, I think we're cool. He posted on his website an article where I wrote about it. So,
oh, there you go. So
I assume we're okay. And he basically, when I asked him about the meeting, he described things that he would say to Bannon in a hypothetical meeting. Huh. And those things were the things that Bannon said, Dugan said to me. So
there you go.
It could have been more difficult, a more difficult task for me with a investigative journalist hat on. But yeah.
So Bannon thinks it's China. China, to me, well, look, the one thing that China doesn't have that the United States model, from the critical perspective of Dugan, is that I don't know that China believes its values are universal and must be spread all over the world. I do know that that's a fundamental bedrock of American liberalism, is this notion of universal rights. And therefore, if you're not with us, you're universally wrong. And we have an obligation to spread this all around the world to all peoples, whether they even want it or not.
To liberate you, right?
Yeah, right? How arrogant can you be? And a quick side note here, it never strikes me, it never stops to amaze me, never ceases to amaze me. Cop chapter, for anybody who was listening last night, inside joke. It never ceases to amaze me how at home we have a model that breeds a religious libertarianism, relative economic libertarianism, sort of freedom of individual expression, etc. But then we take that and then we're just so one-sided with the rest of the world, and we have no respect for a global libertarianism or a pluralism, as Dugan writes about, an ethno-pluralism, and in fact we want to see like the opposite thing happen. So it's very strange, and that's not in the Chinese culture, I don't think.
No, the instruments of their globalization are, I mean, the ideological baggage, I think it seems to just be China.
Yeah, all right.
Us.
Right.
I think you perhaps you could say that that's more honest, at least than dressing it in universalist language and values. But the real instrument is not military or ideological; it's economic.
Yes.
Right? This is the One Road initiative,
Yep.
and the infrastructure investment in Africa in particular. It's a different kind of homogenization and globalization. If we're trying to, go with the traditionalists and kind of see things through their eyes there, yeah. This has to be seen as an entirely different animal. But it is a globalization nonetheless. It is an integration that is plowing over boundaries and borders as it moves forward.
Well, look, this just emphasizes what the MAGA movement has highlighted all along, which is this unholy union between the Uniparty and China. So when what I'm suggesting here is that both Dugan and Bannon are correct, but partially so. And if you put them together, then you've got the whole package, which is the nefarious elements of American liberalism used in a derogatory way here, matched up with the totalitarian, authoritarian, communist, mercantilist, zero-sum economic engine of China. They are together. That's the crux of the whole friggin' problem here. And that's why, 1990s, late 1990s, there was such, ardent protests against the WTO, the Chinese ascension to the WTO. There was all these articles about race to the bottom, whether it would be on wages or on culture or on the environmental standards. And man, has so much of that critique come true. It really is interesting to go back and see, and I write about this in my book, Democrat to Deplorable. Go back and take a look at the people who offered that critique back in the late 90s, and let's talk about them. Let's talk to them now. In fact, man, that's a good idea for me for a future podcast there. But Dugan and Bannon both have it partially right, which is, but together they do have the story, which is what the MAGA folks see, which is the union between the Uniparty, the corporations, the financial, industry here in the United States, the elites, cosmopolitan elites, the politics for the last 50 years. Matt Stoller, I think, would agree with me on this analysis. And then they matched up with China, and now it's all this machine has been built, and now we have an adversary in China, and they are taking over the world. Follow my man Huntsman out there on Twitter. He's a logistics expert. He details the Belt and Road Initiative. Adam Townsend also talks about this quite a bit, guys. It's very important. You have to know what the One Road Initiative is in order to understand geopolitics and the future of conflict in the world, and to really fully appreciate the union between the corporate uniparty and the Chinese, and their attempt to basically homogenize the entire world through low product, low cost production, manufacturing, export finances, and capitalism, whether it's a free capitalism or a state directed capitalism as it is in China. That is the real enemy, and those are the people that we're fighting against, and that's why Trump got elected. Even if average Joe, who God bless, is just busting his ass working all day to put food on the table, it's impossible and irrational for them to even take the time to figure out all this stuff. But we kind of know it, we kind of feel it, we can see it. Great rhetoric hints at it. It motivates us and gives us slogans like "Make America Great Again" that we can project whatever we want. What did you call that? Heuristically open, which I think is just, we were talking about open heuristics, right? Like that phrase itself allows us to project into it. It's fascinating. People are going to study that slogan as they have, but they're going to study it for a long time to come.
It's extremely powerful slogan.
Extremely powerful. And we Donald Trump wasn't sitting down trying to figure out how to make open heuristics, but he hit on it, and he knew that was powerful. And so it's just fascinating to tie this all together, to see that there is, the critics of Bannon, I think, would say that he's like power hungry and a Nazi and hates everybody and is just terrible, rotten, selfish person, unrooted maybe, without any real foundation. But the opposite is very true. He is operating on a lifelong journey of understanding alternative spirituality, as we said earlier. He's developed these notions. He's picked up on other readers. He's aligned himself with other folks that see the world in this context and are taking action in the world as conscious agents to advance this cycle of life that we live in. And when you say it all mystical like that, it's hard to grab onto. But then when you say it very concretely, like, okay, the downside of American universalism is that we are just trying to shove that shit down everybody's throat all around the world. Oh, and we are in bed with China, and we're screwing everybody in America, hollowing out the Rust Belt, driving wages down, environmental destruction, all for what? So that some guys on Wall Street can get rich. They can spread their money around to the politicians and the media folks, so they can all have their fancy dinners and drink their wine and think that they're smarter and better than everybody and better than all of the God-fearing religious people, either in the middle of Russia or even hell in the middle of Iran or in the middle of India or in the middle of the United States. And when you put it all together like that, man, it starts to make some sense, doesn't it?
Well, it's more, I can tell you, Jack, when you're speaking in those terms, as someone who's not, who's might be rooting for a different guy next Tuesday, I still sense a lot of solidarity with that. This is the big problem, and this is where those analyses, and I worry, Trump is not my guy. I do worry about the pushback against him, and whether or not we will find ourselves back exactly in what you were talking about there, in this place. Because another very valid point in all this is the question of sovereignty, is the fact that, you say what you will about nations and nationalism, and they are incendiary entities, no doubt. One good thing about them, and one reason why nationalism and democracy grew up together, very tightly entwined with each other, the notion that a political state would be defined by the people and not by its leader, is that it allows control, and it gives sovereignty to the people who are in it. And in this new world where the centers of power are becoming diffuse and so far away, there's no way for an average person to have any sort of dominion over their lives. It becomes not only is it unreachable to you, but it's inexplicable. It's this vanishing force that you cannot relate to and cannot understand. So yeah, in that particular critique, I think there could be a much wider tent
Yeah.
out there if people are interested in it.
Well, that's what we're trying to do here, just sort of lay the framework and just sort of have conversations and let people make the connections that they want on their own. Your book was just so stimulating and exciting for me. It came to me at a great time. Like, I've never met Steve Bannon, but like a ton of people in my circle work for him, work with him. I get a lot of information. I spoke with, speaking to Alexander Dugan, and then here comes your book recommended to me by a number of guys out there. Mike Cernovich and Jeff Giese in particular were like, hey, you got to talk to Ben. This is a great book. And so it was it's just the right time for me. And it's the right time for us to have this conversation and just to zoom out a little bit and to, try to put a little bit of a broader perspective on it than just a 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, social media driven political cycle. We're going to wrap up here, but do you have some more thoughts on that?
Well, I would just say to you that it's a privilege. It's so hard to talk about Bannon in ways I did not anticipate when I wrote the book, because everyone like has a stance on Bannon, and if you don't affirm it, they get pissed at you. And you have to, in order to get to a point where you can have a conversation about these ideas, you have to pull your foot off the gas a little bit. You just have to. I could not have had the conversation that I've had with you, and no one would have read it if they wouldn't just let themselves be curious just for a moment. Doesn't mean that you're going to like Bannon or Dugan or any of this stuff, but it's a privilege, Jack, to be able to converse with somebody at this level of detail.
Oh, well, thank you very much. It's a privilege for me as well. I got the best job in the whole world, I got to say. I wake up, I think about things that are important and interesting, then I seek out experts in the field, and then I get to talk to them for 2 hours at a time about their work. It really couldn't be any better. I mean, it's really a dream come true, honestly. And just one last note on the inability, without judgment here, the inability of the common man to grasp or have the time or the energy or be prepared to even become aware of, much less struggle with, much less appreciate some of these ideas. That's by design, by the way. People are kept ignorant. There is a certain rationality to being ignorant. The chance that you will affect a meaningful change in politics is pretty low, and so there is a rational ignorant model that I learned at George Mason, libertarians, those guys, weirdos. But then no, I love George Mason. But then we've been polluted. The information space is polluted. Our physical environment is actually polluted. Our physical bodies are polluted. Our physical integrity is degraded. We're fat and obese, and we're sick, and we're spiritually sick, and we are informationally sick. And even like strength is down, grip strengths are down, testosterone is down. By all accounts, even life expectancy is down in the United States among certain groups, notably white folks. It
actually declined in this.
Actually declining, right? And that's not because of any increase in child mortality, right? It's because people are dying in their 40s and 50s, right? It's crazy, and so we're degraded, and when you're degraded in a state like that, you are just sort of by definition unable to process information or to have a meaningful or intentional understanding of the world. And to wrap this all up and to put it in the bow, my Jack Murphy liminal order bow, that's what we're doing in the liminal order. We are dedicated to building our personal sovereignty such that we can conduct intentional understanding of the world. We are not satisfied being passive receivers of information, and we're not settling for being willfully ignorant either. And we have decided to be intentional understanders, to develop a sense of sense making, a skill of sense making, and that starts with physical strength, mental health, emotional stability, a commitment, physical integrity, emotional integrity, having energy, eating right, sleeping right, developing your sense of discernment, that comes from this base of physical and mental and spiritual sort of security. And you can develop your sense of discernment, and then you can develop your sense of what's right and wrong, what's good and bad, and then how to decide for yourself what's good and bad, and then how to embody those values in the world. And that's what we're trying to do, is sort of counteract all this stuff so that people can be a little bit, more able to understand all of these things that are going on, because it's essential. It's essential if you want to have any peace in your life, to know what the river you're in. You may be just bobbing down the rapids, but like, it helped me to know what river I'm in, so maybe I can grab the rock and go the way that I want to go. And this conversation is all part of that intentional understanding. And Ben, you've been a tremendous guest. We've had a number of excellent conversations behind the scenes leading up to this. I really, truly appreciate your time and energy. The book is fantastic. I could do share screen, but I'm not. I'm just going to pull this up right here. War for Eternity, Inside Bannon's Far-Right Circle of Global Power Brokers. Not as sensational as the subtitle may indicate, but truly an important book. It really is going to give people an understanding of the backgrounds and intentions of the people that are actually making a difference in the world, getting people elected, shaping global policy, changing foreign policy, changing economic policy, and the why of what they're doing, and put it into a context that's as big as possible, right? Non-linear, eternal time. And the reason that the title is called War for Eternity is because these players truly believe that this is a struggle for a spiritual moment in time and in eternity that is essential to their human happiness and evolution, and etc. So the title isn't a misnomer. It really is in their perspectives, and that's why people are so strong and ardent about what they're doing. Ben, thank you very much, sir. Ben Teitelbaum, an assistant professor at Colorado University. I'm sorry, Teitelbaum, my bad. At the professor at Colorado University. Find him on Twitter at Ben Teitel, Teitel. Teitel on Twitter. Get him there. Get the book, War for Eternity. It's on Amazon. Wonderful book. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it, Ben.
Thank you, Jack.
All right, buddy. Stick around here for 1 sec. Guys out there, subscribe, hit the like button, share this podcast, share the video. It'll be coming out on audio as well on RSS. Subscribe there. Follow me on Twitter at Jack Murphy Live. Hit subscribe here on YouTube. I'm all over the internet, Jack Murphy Live, Instagram, Facebook as well. Twitter is my main home. And if you're interested in what we're talking about in the liminal order, come check it out, liminal-order.com. Sign up for the wait list, get the emails, learn what we're all about. And when the time is ready, make the jump and join us. Everybody, thank you very much. This has been Jack Murphy Live. We'll be back soon. Until then, just keep on keeping on, fellas. Thanks, everybody.